You're listening to Speaking Side Mount, the podcast where we talk all things side mount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and side mount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top side mount divers. Whether you're new to side mount, been side mount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things side mount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
It was quite a way into the cave, and I'd squeezed into a vertical restriction at the end. I had high hopes, but unfortunately didn't go anywhere. And it took me a bit more effort than I hoped, mental effort, to squeeze back out. And just as I did, it effectively felt like my throat collapsed and I was about to pass out. I remember thinking quite clearly, oh wow, I'm about to pass out. I need to bail out now. So I bailed out and had a pretty bad time.
Hey, welcome back to Speaking Side Mount. I'm Steve Davis. The short clip you just listened to is Australian Tech Diver of the Year Stephen Fordyce, reliving his harrowing near-death experience where he had a laryngospasm at over 50 meters while on a push cave exploration dive in Tasmania, Australia. To say this was harrowing is an understatement, but Stephen's story of survival and subsequently what he's learned about the incident is as compelling as it is terrifying. This episode is brought to you by our brilliant sponsor X-Deep and by the patrons of Speaking Side Mount. Huge thanks to both for their support that makes everything you're about to listen to possible. While I'm recording this episode intro from the ProTech base camp in Tulum, Mexico, having just completed 11 days of, to be honest, pretty challenging but super rewarding training with Patrick Woodman. I started with KISS Sidewinder Mod 2 training. This is the normoxic trimix level, allowing me to dive the Sidewinder to 60 meters or 200 feet. I had the great privilege to have Miko Pasi join the course as assistant instructor. You should remember that Miko was part of the Euro team involved in the Thai cave rescue and also my guest on episode 64. You definitely should go back and check out his story of the rescue. It was amazing. Now, the course was extremely demanding, and I very much felt like every part of my diving and Sidewinder configuration was tested, broken down, and then put back together again better than it was before. We did very long days, some over 12 hours, including a heap of classroom time, planning and setup work, and then the dives. I learned new techniques and skills that will stay with me, and I feel my diving took a dramatic leap forward. Now, having received the handshake from Patrick on the last day of the Mod 2 course, I thought that this would be the pinnacle of my trip. I was wrong. Another summit stood before me in the form of the Cave CCR course. This course is essential for rebreather divers to learn how their rebreather changes cave diving practice and to replicate and refine their cave diving planning and execution. For me, this course was even more challenging and yes, ultimately rewarding. I'll be honest, most of my cave skills were pretty rusty. I mean, who practices passing restrictions blindfolded and gas sharing after their cave course is completed? I learned a truckload on dive planning for CCR cave dives. All of my emergency drills were fine-tuned, and I learned at times the hard way how easy things such as navigation can get away from you when you're stressed in zero visibility. Overall, an amazing experience and one that will stay with me and my diving from here forward. So back to our episode, Stephen Fordyce, Seconds from Death. In addition to recalling the near-death experience, Stephen relates some on his diving background. We talk about how he combines his engineering business with diving. We discuss what it takes to be a cave explorer, and then he shares on his exploration efforts in Tasmania, Australia. All this and much, much more on this episode of Speaking Side Mount.
And we are recording. Hey, Stephen, welcome to Speaking Side Mount.
G'day, Steve. Good to be on.
It's awesome to meet you again. It's quite rare for me, actually, to be interviewing someone that I've actually met in person. And you and I met just a couple of weeks ago now at the AusTech conference, which was just simply spectacular. So how are you doing?
Yeah, good. You're right. AusTech was absolutely spectacular, especially not having had it for a while and having had a whole global pandemic since the last one. I must say I'm actually quite pumped about diving and stuff having had it. Didn't hurt that they gave me an award. Even so, it was just a great weekend, catching up with all the people that you rarely get to see otherwise.
Yeah, for me, it's been really interesting because it's my first Oztech since I started speaking side mount. Yeah, absolutely. I started speaking side mount in 2018, and I've had the opportunity through that to meet divers all over the world, virtually interviewing and chatting. And at the end of an interview, you really feel like you get to know someone. And then to actually start to meet some people that I've interviewed, I bumped into Robin Quester at Grant Pierce's place, and then we dived together, and meeting people like Maria Bollerup and others was just amazing. So it was thrilling to really go along and to meet people. Michael Manduno's another one. He and I have been chatting for months about side mount diving and other things. And so really, really enjoyed it. So let's talk about you for a moment and get a bit of a very, very simple introduction going. So you're an engineer, a cave and sump diver. You're renowned as one of the very best push divers, at least in Australia, if not the world. You're the survivor of what we can only describe as a terrifying near-death incident that we're going to get into a bit later. You were the recipient of the 2019 Emerging Explorer Award at Oztech, and now, as you mentioned, you're the 2022 Tech Diver of the Year. That's just amazing. I mean, how does that feel coming out of that conference and receiving that award?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. Mostly just being in the company of so many other people that I look up to and respect, and seeing the things that they've done. And people seem to think that what I've done is maybe on the same level. It's pretty awesome. It's not necessarily very glamorous what I do, and entirely sure how cool it really is, but it's important to me and it's important to the people that I do it with. Yes. So, yeah, that's a really nice thing.
Yeah, and it really is at the sharp, pointy end of technical diving, isn't it? I mean, when you think about the different aspects of technical diving, whether it be deep decompression diving, shipwreck diving, cave diving, and then cave exploration, and then what you're doing, which is really exploring or sump diving and doing a combination of dry caving and wet cave diving. It's really, really at one of the most challenging ends of technical diving, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely got a lot of things around it. The diving's quite challenging, sometimes very challenging, but a lot of the time it's normal cave diving, but the mental and the logistical effort around it just adds a whole large burden that has a big impact on everything.
Yeah, brilliant. And I've got a few things I want to ask you about that as well as to how you work through that. But let's get started by having you tell us a little bit about how you got into diving.
Well, I've always done lots of different outdoor things, and growing up, my parents used to take me bushwalking, and we would do sailing with my dad. I went to uni, joined the bushwalking club at Monash University in Melbourne. That was pretty cool. I did some stuff. And then when I was 20, start of the year, would have been 2006 or 7, I went to the O-Week Carnival, and there was a dive club, an underwater club. And I thought, oh, yeah, that could be fun. And I went up to them and I said, give me your pitch. You know, tell me why I should join.
Why should I become a diver?
Yeah, diving sounds pretty cool, but I want to hear it. And so he said, oh, yeah, well, you know, you join the club, and it's really cheap, and we have a boat and all these things. I sort of went, oh, yeah, that's viable. That sounds cool.
It's really cheap. Where did that come from?
The uni diving was cheap.
Yeah.
Student unions and buckets of money and things.
Right.
So one thing led to another, and 2 years later I was the president of the dive club, and I spent a lot of years putting a lot of energy into club trips and ocean diving and driving the boat, doing all sorts of strange things as I started and progressed on my cave diving journey.
And how did that start? How did you go from this uni club? I'm assuming you're doing a lot of open water diving and ocean diving. How did that progress into cave diving?
It actually didn't take very long, because I just so happened to live such that my local dive shop is Ocean Divers in East Bentley in Melbourne, which at the time was run by Jane and Warwick, who were two pretty prolific instructors in the Cave Divers Association of Australia. So, you know, I was in the shop for my open water seeing posters of cave diving on the wall. And I actually remember I looked at them and I went, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That's something I reckon I'd do. Yeah, a lot of people come round to it slowly, but I distinctly remember looking at it and going, yeah, I'm going to do that.
It's a special personality, isn't it? Because almost every day I tell people about the diving I do, and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, I could never do that. And, you know, I have to tell them, nobody just wakes up in the morning and goes cave diving. Of course, it's a journey to progress to do that sort of diving. But most people find it quite scary, and obviously feelings of claustrophobia, all those sort of things. And yet there's certain personalities where it's just, yeah, man, that's exactly what I want to do. What about you drove you towards that?
Initially, it was probably just being cheap as a student, and I realised if I did my deep cavern, which is what it was, deep cavern sinkhole diver, that would be the equivalent of a deep diver certificate and a wreck diver certificate and a bit of other stuff, and I could also dive the sinkholes at Mount Gambier. You know, I'd learned some skills. I thought that was pretty good bang for my buck. It was also just pretty exciting as well. And I still remember my first dive in Goulden Sinkhole. I was grossly underprepared, full of young male confidence and testosterone. I remember it was the most foreign environment I'd ever experienced.
Yeah.
It was just weird. I didn't probably love it first off, but I sort of fumbled my way through the course, learning more than I thought I would. And I realised how much of a better diver it made me. And I'd actually recommend, anyone that's serious about their diving, do your basic cave course, just the first level. It's not squeezy or claustrophobic or anything, and it'll make you that much better of a diver, even if you never go cave diving again.
Yeah, 100%. I absolutely agree with that. And to be honest, that's what drove me to cave diving was the skill set. Unlike you, I kind of grew up and didn't even know that cave diving existed. And I was diving for many, many years, not even understanding that this sort of level was there. And then told this story a few times, seeing Steve Bogarts and Ponderosa just doing some skills. And I thought, holy crap, I want that skill level. And of course, then it can take you places. But it was really about building that platform and that immense trim and stability and control that I really wanted. And of course, that's exactly right. That's what you learn either before or during basic cave, because it becomes essential later on as you progress.
Yep, absolutely. And so then I didn't progress too fast through there. Probably took me a couple of years, maybe 4 years or so, to get from first starting to doing my advanced cave. Mount Gambier trips can be a bit expensive for a student, so I'd pace myself a bit, and I was doing other things, lots of ocean diving and club trips and things. But yeah, eventually I'd sort of worked my way up to advanced cave and then started just going a bit further. I'm the sort of person that gets bored easily, or at least, I'll do the most amazing dive ever, and then I'll do it a second time, and it's still fantastic. Mm-hmm. By the fifth time, I'm sort of going, well, this is still amazing, but it's not doing it for me. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit sad. I really wish I could just go and do the same awesome dive, and it would be still awesome, but it's just not the way I roll. So, yeah, I've tended to move on to new things within the cave diving that was heading a bit more off the beaten track and into sumps and other things.
Yeah, and that was really my next question, is how did you progress onto the exploration aspect? Because I'd say this a lot too, cave diving and exploration diving are quite different in terms of the mindset, skill sets and experience levels that you need. So how did you start to build that into your diving?
Yeah, exploration, it is very different to normal cave diving. I mean, it's a pretty hard thing to get experience at because, it's mostly been done. It's one thing to go and push your way through some tight restriction following a line, but doing that first, it's a whole different ball game.
Totally.
It's all about getting your foot in the door and showing you're nuts enough or motivated enough. I was lucky enough to get myself into a project exploring Elk River Cave in Victoria, Eastern Victoria, sort of the opposite direction from Mount Gambier. That was a proper sump diving exploration project. So we would do dry caving to get to the water, a nice streamway about 150 metres below the entrance. And then we would go along and we'd dive and crawl and walk and then dive again. And that was a really kind of intense, consuming project that all of us that were involved, there were sort of 5 or so regulars and then a few that came now and again. It really developed all our skills and mentality and everything else. It took us a couple of years. By the time we finished off, or by the time we gave up, we were at the bottom of the 10th sump, and it would take us about maybe 15 hours to get there. And then we'd come back, camp in the cave, and come out. It ended in a restriction that was too small for my thighs to fit through. We're pretty glad because it's getting pretty hard by then.
Yeah, I heard you talk about Bill Stone when you were in your first presentation when I listened to it, and just listening to the story of those guys spending such a long period of time underground and going such immense distances is just unreal, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is. And I suspect that's beyond my, perhaps my level of enjoyment. I have people come along on things. I'll evaluate them for the envelope of survivability and the envelope of enjoyment. Obviously, you've got to be able to survive. You've got to be pretty conservative with that one.
Yes.
But the envelope of enjoyability, that's the trickier one, but it's also the one where you can afford to take a chance because, you want people to have fun and come back.
You don't want pissed off and cranky people in your team either, do you?
No, it's not fun for anyone. Fundamentally, we're doing it for fun. I quite like there's not really a professional aspect to it. It's for fun. It's because we want to. That means you have to make some compromise. Well, probably a healthy thing.
Yeah. Now, you're an engineer as well, and I'm an engineer too, just incidentally. So, mechanical and steam engineer from way, way back, kind of growing out of it now, I guess I would say. However, one of the things I love is the fact that you've combined engineering and diving. And I had a look through your catalogue for TFM engineering the other day, and I'd sort of liken it to being porn for technical divers who are engineers. It was just unreal. So tell us a bit about what you do there and how you combine diving with engineering.
I've probably never been accused of being a porn star before, but I'll take it. Yeah, so I've had an interesting, varied life, I guess. I studied mechatronics engineering and computer science. It took 5 years. I picked it because it was broad. I could do mechanical engineering, electronics, computer programming, a bit of other stuff, chemical stuff as well. And I actually ended up falling into a job for a company in Melbourne that designed and built lots of compressed gas equipment. My interview precursor was I actually rang them up asking for parts so I could make a transfiller, so I could transfer oxygen from one tank to another. The spare parts guy actually talked to the boss and said, hey, this kid actually seems to have some relevant information. So I ended up being the only candidate they interviewed, and I told them all about my technical diving and gases. So I spent the next couple of years designing big compressed gas equipment for liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen, high-pressure compressed gases, CO2, all the pure air gases mostly.
Awesome. And such a great background, again, for leading into diving, right? Combining those two things together, because, I mean, just about any dive centre's got some element of compressors and cylinders, and then understanding how they're designed. And also, certainly in New Zealand, it's really tough here in terms of the legislative requirements and all the regulations around compressed gas cylinders and so on. So great background to have in diving.
Yeah, it always helps having skin in the game. I especially like doing oxygen systems, even though they're painful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just because it's oxygen, that's what I breathe when I'm diving, and nitrogen makes up the balance, so that's fun too. Helium projects are pretty rare, but they happen occasionally. Yeah, so that was good, and I got lots of good practical experience project managing and designing and learning how to actually finish projects, which can be a difficult thing. I always did things on the side as well. Eventually that morphed into TFM engineering, which I've been doing full-time for about 6 years now. It's good. It's a sort of a lifestyle business. I can be flexible. I can take it in whatever direction I feel like. It's nice. It's something that I sort of want to do. Well, that's the idea anyway. Yeah. Certainly not getting rich or anything, but it keeps me going.
For sure. You're probably aware that I interviewed Ryan Kichkowski. I can't remember how long ago it was now, maybe a couple of years back even now, but I know from your Facebook profile as well, the picture there is sure one of the pinnacles of your engineering achievements, which is the sled that you guys use to tow all your equipment into Toad Hall in Cocklebiddy. Tell us a bit about the development of that and what it did for that particular expedition.
Yeah, I've done a lot of really cool things with Ryan Kichkowski, also with Liz Rogers, who was on that trip.
Yeah. Yes.
And in case anyone sees that picture, it was just the three of us. We basically spent 2 weeks moving that pile of gear from one place to another. The sled, I put that one together. I certainly didn't come up with the idea. Sleds have been done in Cocklebiddy for quite a while. I mean, ever since it started being properly explored. But it's just a good way to take a lot of stuff, and essentially there's a limit to how much you can clip onto you just because it's too heavy. We had a bit too much stuff, to be honest, but we didn't want to be caught short. So we had stacks of bailout, steel tanks as storage cylinders. So the sled's basically some PVC pipe that's sealed and kind of floaty, and then it has some floodable flotation chambers on it as well. And then we tacked on a wing just to help us. It turned out that was pretty important. Who knew that when you're packing a sled, the most important characteristic is either neutral buoyancy or fixed buoyancy? So we had a few food packets and bags and things that actually compressed at depth. Even with the wing fully deflated, we all had to grab it and scoot it downwards to get it to sink. And then by the time we hit the max depth of about 18 metres, we were actively trying to keep it off the bottom. It was a real pig of a thing.
Yeah.
Getting to Toad Hall should take about an hour and 15 minutes, and it took us 4 hours. It was not very pleasant. Once we got there, it meant we could spend 3 good dives in Sump 3, which is what it was all about.
Yeah, Ryan was pretty proud of the fact that he had some beer in there as well. I'm not sure if you got to partake in that.
I'm actually a non-drinker.
Okay.
Not for any particular reason, apart from I never acquire the taste. I do enough silly things anyway. I don't need alcohol to compound that.
Fair enough. Right, let's get on a bit. So your first presentation at Oztech was titled Exploration, Sump Diving and Dye Tracing in Tasmania. And in your presentation, you showed a map of Tasmania, which I thought was cool. I've got a global audience here, and I'm sure not many of them know where Tasmania is. So can you describe where Tasmania is in Australia?
Tasmania is an island state. It's got the same state status as the other 7 on the mainland. It sits off the south of Melbourne on the eastern side of Australia. And it's interesting from a cave perspective because it's got so much limestone and the geology is kind of different from the rest of Australia. Apart from anything else, it's got so many different karst and cave areas, and it's got the deepest caves in Australia. They're more than twice as deep as the ones on the mainland. They are partly what drew me in. And so caving in Tasmania, in the Junior Florentine, which is under Mount Field National Park, that's what's consumed me most of my motivation for the last 5 to 7 years, I guess, with a few breaks to go to other places.
And tell us about the exploration that you're doing there now in terms of the dye tracing and so on.
Yeah, it works really well for what I like. It's been fairly well explored, but there's still plenty to do. So that sort of works well for me because I can come in and join things together, build, apply analysis, which I'd like. It's not too easy. There's not lots and lots of fresh caves everywhere and you don't know where to start. And it's not too hard. Well, it's quite hard, but where it's all been found.
Yeah.
Because, so Tasmania, it's southern latitudes, it's temperate rainforest, and a lot of it's untouched temperate rainforest. Magical. There's lots of water, and the water flows into the caves, being on a mountain range. So there's a whole series of streams that join together and then make bigger caves, and eventually it all comes out in one big river that comes out at the base of the mountain. It's a known thing in cave exploration and study. If you put some dye in and see where it goes, then you can establish some of the links between the caves that you can't actually physically go. Or you might be able to physically go, but you can't yet. That dye tracing is something I've done a lot of in the last couple of years over COVID. So I live in Melbourne, and you might know Melbourne as one of the most locked down cities in the world over COVID. I think we had nearly a year across 6 different lockdowns.
Even more than us, so that was that's saying something, hey?
Yeah, I had a lot of time where not much else was happening, and I spent most of that doing data nerd stuff and also building these electronic dye detectors, which have been really cool. You can buy them, but they're really expensive, and I like to think mine are better. And I put out, 15, 20 of them, and then we've done dye releases all over the place. It's a formal project with the Southern Tasmanian Caverniers, STC. We do have permits and all that sort of thing to do it properly.
Cool. And tell us about what's going on with the exploration right now, where you're at and what's happening.
Yeah, so the exploration, I think we're in a good time. A lot of the major caves have been found, explored, surveyed, mapped, so we have a good idea how things work in the area, but there's gaps. So we have a large streamway cave here, and then we have another one a bit further downstream, but there's a 1.5 kilometre gap in the middle, and we know that should be big streamway cave too and be really cool. So trying to find a way into that is the thing to do. And then even more interesting, there's a 5 kilometre gap further downstream, which should be even bigger. So there's different ways and different other caves that go sort of close to them, and each one of those needs a project, and a project could take 6 months or a year or 4 years. Yeah, there's a lot of effort and a lot of sort of commitment and interest. It's a big exercise. It takes a while.
Yeah. And very much like a lot of cave projects around the world, it's about connecting systems together from what you're saying. There's one explored cave, there's another one that's nearby. They should join together, so it's finding the connections.
Yeah, and a connection, I like to explain it. Caves can end in 3 ways. One, they get too hard and they still go, but you just can't be bothered going back there, or you don't have, and that's a bit sad. The second way that caves can end is they crap out, so they end at a brick wall, or they get too small, or there's a big pile of rocks. That's also disappointing. Whereas number 3, which is the only really satisfying thing, is that the cave connects into somewhere else. So conceivably, it doesn't end. It just keeps going, and you could do 3 trip. It's very satisfying. Relatively rare that you get to do that, but it's a good thing to aim for. And I guess bringing it back to diving, the cool thing about this area, because there's so much water and you have streams, inevitably there'll be sumps. And a lot of the time, those sumps are so difficult to get to that they haven't ever been dived, or they've only been dived, once 30 years ago. And so that's where I've been able to have a bit of success of coming in at the right time where they've been found, but the guys that found them, they had other cool things to do instead. So they're there for those that are up for it, and I've been happy to grab quite a few of them.
Yeah, awesome. And you say you're up for it, which is obviously an important part of it, but I know that some of the equipment choices that you're making and the equipment that's available now, including what you're making yourself, is really important to that. So let's talk a little bit about the equipment that you dive. Obviously, this is speaking side mount, and we know that side mount diving and cave diving are tied together. Tell us a bit about your equipment journey and what you're using and what tools help you do your exploration projects.
This is probably a good time to make a terrible confession, which is that I actually really like diving back mount. I rarely do it, but it's just nice and just solid, and it doesn't work for me for most of what I do, but the rare occasions, it's nice. So it's definitely side mount diving in here, if nothing else, because you don't want things to be heavier than they need to be. So everything needs to be taken apart to be transported, and a lot of it's just low. You wouldn't fit through with back mount, so it's by far the best tool for the job. It's fairly standard cave diving equipment, so we'll have exposure protection. It is 7 degrees Celsius, which is quite cold.
Yeah,
I'll do a lot of things in a wetsuit. A lot of the dives are pretty shallow, and by the time you do a 100-meter long dive and then have to get out and walk somewhere, I find I get too sweaty in a dry suit. But the dry suits. Then cylinders, it depends what the dive does. Sometimes we use carbon fiber cylinders because they're really light. You do need to strap lots of lead to them, like 6 kilos per tank.
It's mega buoyant, huh?
Oh, yeah, they're dangerously buoyant. If the lead came off, you'd have to ditch it. Making sure the lead's strapped on well is a big thing. The lead can stay there, so that's ideal if we're doing sort of multiple goes. But, yeah, they're obviously not ideal for pushing because they're quite bulbous and...
Great for carrying in, though, right?
Yeah, you get a spectacular amount of gas for not much weight. Apart from that, always have a guideline, have our backup lights. We definitely wear helmets because we're caving to get there, and there's a good chance we'll be caving beyond a sump. Also just handy to have your hands free. We'll often use some silk pegs, and obviously we've got a survey on the way out. A helmet and a helmet light are pretty vital for this sort of thing.
Yep, open circuit and rebreather.
Yeah, good question. Most of the dives in this area are just open circuit. It's not worth the complexity or the extra loads and stuff of the rebreather. There's 1 or 2 things that are rebreather worthy. So far, all of the deep caves and the potentially good sumps have been pretty shallow open circuit, like 25 metres tops. And even that was quite brief.
Brilliant. Let's move on to your second presentation, and I'm starting to hesitate because you simply blew away the audience with your second presentation, and you and I spoke off mic a little bit about whether you were happy to share it again, because it was definitely a near-death experience, and the title of the presentation was Laryngospasm, a very near miss and another way for rebreathers to kill you. Talking about rebreathers obviously leads into this, and you shared an immense amount of detail on exactly what happened to you, including video footage, which unfortunately we can't share, but if anyone wants to see it and they can sign on, I think you may need to pay for it. But the AusTech conference has video of all of the presentations, including Stephen's presentation that we're about to talk about. So I would highly recommend going to watch that again if you're interested. The feedback afterwards, I listened to every single person who asked you a question and they all thanked you, and it was really, really positive, which was great. Can I ask you to share again the experience, or relive it and share what happened? I'll let you lead into it and obviously share as much or as little as you're happy to.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll put in my standard disclaimer that, Mum, if you've found your way here and you're listening, just switch off for this bit, skip ahead, 10 minutes or something. I did this presentation a while ago. I had a laryngospasm, diving rebreather. Among many, many things that were of interest to the diving community, the one that stuck out most to me was that I didn't know that it was a thing. I didn't know this was a possibility, hence the name of the talk, a new way for rebreathers to kill you. And I actually slightly regret using that terminology because having put it out there, a lot of people have actually said to me that it's happened to them on open circuit as well. So it's not particularly common, but when it happened to me, I had no idea what was going on. And that made it all the worse. As an aside, I still got to fix up a few details around it. I hope we'll be able to get that presentation into the public domain eventually. so people can see it on YouTube or something. Yeah, there's some issues around that, but I'll have a chat to Sue. I'm sure we can figure something out. So,
tell us about the dive that you were doing when this all happened.
Yeah, so it was a cave dive to 55 metres. So I was on trimix on a rebreather, Kiss sidekick, which I do like and still like. It works well for me and what I need a rebreather for. It was quite a way into the cave, and I'd squeezed into a vertical restriction at the end. I had high hopes, but unfortunately it didn't go anywhere. And it took me a bit more effort than I hoped, mental effort, to squeeze back out. And just as I did, it effectively felt like my throat collapsed and I was about to pass out. I remember thinking quite clearly, oh, wow, I'm about to pass out. I need to bail out now. So I bailed out and had a pretty bad time.
Let me just describe something from the video at this point. So what we heard on the video was you absolutely struggling to breathe. I think there was a term you used. There was a sort of a yelling, but you effectively couldn't get any air into your lungs whatsoever.
Yeah, so the medical term is stridor, and the term that immediately came to mind for me was reverse screaming. Rather than my throat collapsing, it was actually a laryngospasm where my vocal cords had closed for whatever reason. And as I tried to inhale, I was forcing enough gas past the vocal cords to make this awful screaming noise, but it wasn't really enough to breathe.
So let's talk about your orientation right now. So you're inverted, head down, is that correct?
Yeah, in hindsight, I didn't really respect the characteristics of the rebreather enough. And so anyone that's dived a side mount rebreather, particularly the KISS sidekick, will know when you're head down, there's a very negative static lung load. So you're basically trying to breathe a vacuum cleaner. The exhale gets sucked out of you and you've got to suck really hard to get an inhale. And so that really wasn't helping the cause and is the most likely contributor to having that laryngospasm.
Along with the possibility that you got some spittle or water or something that had actually hit your vocal cords at that point, right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that came out of the conversations I had with a few different medical people, was that the obvious thing was that the work of breathing, but it was conceivable, possible, that a bit of cold water had been sucked in past the mouthpiece, or a bit of caustic lung butter, or even just a bit of saliva was enough to trigger it.
So let's paint the picture. You're struggling to breathe. You're inverted in a restriction, which in itself is tough enough, let alone going through this sort of experience. You said you bailed out. Tell us what happened from that point.
Fortunately, I actually got through the restriction just before it all happened, so I was back into a bigger space. I managed to bail out and still couldn't get an inhale. And at this point, I was really, really out of it mentally and basically working off muscle memory. And for whatever reason, I pressed the purge button. I guess it's part of my bailout drill. And that positive pressure was enough to force some gas in, and I slowly got things breathing again.
Tell us what happened next.
So after that, I was pretty out of it. I don't know if I've mentioned this. So this was a push dive where we deliberately planned that I'd be solo at that point. I don't want that to distract from the lessons. Obviously, it's pretty suboptimal not to have someone there. So I took quite a few minutes just to get my head back together, even enough to get out. I mean, I knew I needed to get out of there, but I really didn't have the mental or physical capacity to do it.
Yeah.
And then just as I'd started to get to a point where I could, I went back on the loop, got everything sorted, started breathing comfortably on the loop, and then it all happened again. So that's one of the other lessons I'd like to share, particularly with everyone, is wasting time messing around going back on the loop at depth was a pretty bad idea. But because I hadn't practiced that, and I hadn't practiced that decision-making process of, no, the loop is bad, get out of here, sort it out when I'm shallower, that was all a bit cloudy when I was mentally impaired. So I wasted 3 or 4 minutes of bailout at 55 metres getting through that.
Amazing, amazing. And I mean, you made a comment at the end of it, and I'll remind you of it, and maybe you can recount it in your own words. You said the words to the effect of every piece of training you'd done, every drill that you'd practiced, every dive that you'd done, every piece of experience that you'd built to that point in time was only just enough to get you out of that experience. Absolutely.
So my GoPro was running the whole time, and where it sits in front of my face means you get a very good first-person view of what was happening, and it also, that's why it picked up the breathing sounds so well. And people have watched that, and they've listened to the story, and they've said, oh, you know, you handled that really well, and it was really good and smooth. My feeling is that it wasn't. It was an absolute mess, and all those little muscle memory things and technique and mental preparation and having done workup dives and things, yeah, every little bit. I actually afterwards went and talked to as many of my instructors I could find and said, hey, thanks. That little course that I did 5 years ago, I reckon that made the difference. Every little thing I ever did.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think too few of us practice skills as well. I had the great benefit of, during my diving education, I was working at Gozo Technical, and every single dive we practiced skills, and it became almost a habit where at the end of the dive at 6 meters or whatever, you'd practice every single skill that you could possibly think of, and the ones that you were weakest at, you'd work on the hardest. And so we all became extraordinarily good at all the skill practice. And it's that, as you mentioned, muscle memory, that repetition of skill and technique that comes back to help you when you really, really need it. And if you don't practice it, then you don't really have that bank of experience that you might need to lean on when you do really need it.
Yeah, I really hadn't appreciated just how debilitated I'd be in a situation. It wasn't really very rational or anything. It all just sort of happened automatically. That made the difference, I think.
For sure. So out of that experience, obviously you survived, and that's amazing in itself. But there's always lessons, right? Hindsight bias, we can all sort of see some things there. But what did you take out of it in terms of what you would do next time, or what you are doing now that you weren't doing before?
Respecting the limits of the gear is the obvious one. I mean, when you're doing a push dive, there's a fine line between pushing as hard as you need to and pushing too hard. So the worker breathing on the vertical section was pushing it too hard. I wouldn't do that again.
Do you think you basically bail out open circuit to do that section?
Yeah, or go head up so that I had positive pressure rather than negative pressure in my lungs.
So I hear people talk about going backwards through a restriction. I haven't done that. Tell me how that experience is. Obviously, you can see when you head first, which is the obvious benefit.
I much prefer to go head first because I can see. If you can't see, it doesn't matter. And you can also, going head first, you can feel. It's a lot easier to feel what's going on with your hands rather than trying to go through feet first and fins waving around. And
hearing boning equipment and all that sort of thing as well.
Yeah,
and, you tend to be streamlined forward, don't we? So,
yeah, I'd rather not, which is probably why I kept doing it that way. The bailout was a good lesson. Fortunately, we had lots of bailout. I went through 2 cylinders. It was a lot of gas, and I spent 8 minutes at depth at 55 meters just getting things together. We had plenty of bailout. I had heaps left after that, even though I used 2 cylinders or something. That made a big difference. I hadn't properly appreciated that. I just did it because it seemed like a good idea, but now I really feel it.
Obviously, my dives in 10K that I did recently, I'm calculating my bailout for that. And of course, we all go through a process of what's my sac rate, what's my swimming speed, how much gas do I need? You double your sac rate. But is doubling even enough? I don't think most of us, unless you've been in that situation, have a real appreciation for how stressed and how out of it you can be if you have a really, really bad situation.
Absolutely. I had no idea. And I mean, that's the thing where diving with a buddy or a team could also make the difference.
Yeah.
You know, solo diving's a tool for a job, and it needs its own respect and training and experience and a lot of it to do reasonably well. But it's a consideration, that's for sure.
Yeah, actually, I was running that through my head as you were talking about that earlier, which is what benefit would a buddy have been to you in that situation? And obviously, they can't solve the breathing issue for you, but just having someone there would be something of a comforting influence on you. But the point you just raised there, where they're carrying their bailout as well, and there's bailout staged for them because they're there with you, means it creates a much different dynamic in terms of the gas that you've got.
Yeah, I do use the solo diving tool for what I do quite a bit. I'm fairly happy doing most things solo in the right context. In this one, I suspect that I would have actually fought someone off. They would have become really impatient with the time that I needed to get my head right, and they either would have, well, I suspect they would have left me and we would have had a really awkward conversation later.
Yeah, not advocating that you needed a buddy either, by the way. I've talked to so many explorers and virtually all of them are solo diving at some point in their explorations, whether it be they enter the cave as a team and then they'll go off and investigate leads, effectively solo diving. Again, I've interviewed a lot of the CDG guys, and while they dive in teams, they solo dive in teams. So it's very much an aspect of sump diving, cave diving. And while it's very much frowned upon for good reasons when you're just doing traditional cave diving, as we talked earlier, exploration is a different thing. It's a different type of diving and needs different techniques and tools. So no way was I suggesting that you should have had a buddy. It's just what benefit would they have been had someone been there?
Yeah, no, people will think that I should have had a buddy, and that's fine. And it's a funny one. Depends on your upbringing and your context and other things as well.
Exactly, and where you're diving as well, right?
Absolutely. So it's good to talk about it and to qualify it so that people don't get the wrong idea.
Awesome. Well, mate, thanks so much for sharing. And again, I've been part of a book that Stratus casted called Close Calls. And there's a lot of very, very prominent divers in there who have shared their experiences. And there was really, really good feedback to that book as well. Did an episode on it with Stratus some time ago. And I featured, I got stuck inside a shipwreck, which was nothing at all like yours. I was simply entrapped for a period of time or entangled for a longer period of time than I really felt comfortable with at that stage of my diving career. It was certainly pretty stressful for me at that time, and clearly I got out of it. But there's different levels to stories. Yours is certainly a bit different. And there were a few in that book where I think there's nothing that compares to when you're struggling for gas or when you're struggling to breathe, the urgency that brings. And as you say, the severely debilitating effect it can have on you mentally and physically and compromising your ability to deal with it. It's just a whole different level.
It's definitely a good thing you've touched on. I've actually mentioned that one of the things that actually got me over the line of sharing this, it took a few years. This is all a few years ago, and I've been mulling it over ever since, was Gareth Locke's book, Under Pressure. At the start of every chapter, there's a case study where a reasonably well-known diver details something that happened to them. That actually was quite inspiring for me to go, oh, wow, like if these people are sharing things that happened to them, well, I can too. And hopefully I can pass that on, and someone else that saw my presentation might share something else, which makes us all safer.
100%. Here's how I see your story as well. I mean, many of the stories, including mine, I made some pretty significant mistakes that led to mine. When I say significant, they're only small in their own right, but when you combine them together, they led to the incident that I had. Yeah, you didn't respect your rebreather in terms of worker breathing and that orientation. However, it's a long bow to draw to say that you shouldn't do that, because people do it all the time. You hear people saying, hey, yeah, I know how the rebreather breathes in this orientation, so I'm just ready for it. What you're not ready for is the way that played out. How could you have predicted that?
Laryngospasm, who knew that was a thing?
Yeah, it was interesting. Actually, something else that was cool about the presentation, Professor Simon Mitchell came up and made some comments from a medical physician and anaesthetist perspective. And it was interesting to hear him say it does happen in the operating theatre every now and again, and how they deal with it. And also interesting for him to muse on the likely causes, which, as you said, is probably the worker breathing and the negative static lung load that you experienced, with that potentially combined with something else. But it was interesting how they solve it in the operating theatre the same way you did, introduce positive pressure into the airway. And the fact that it happens once, it's quite likely that it'll happen again in close proximity to that first event. It is interesting that physiologically this can happen.
It might be worth pointing out that nobody picked up what it was. We had debrief with the team. We all sort of thought it was a CO2 hit or something weird. And it wasn't until I showed the video to Professor Simon Mitchell that he said, that's stridor, that's the laryngospasm. That was the first time anyone said, oh, no, you've had this thing. It shows the value of continuing to investigate and continuing to ask why. Yeah. It's another thing that I've had from Gareth Locke.
Yeah, because now we know. I guess before, thinking that was a CO2 hit would have taken you down a completely the wrong path, which could have been due to worker breathing as well, right? So absolutely, that's possible. Yeah, immense. I will share a link to the Oztech presentations in the podcast notes, and if anyone wants to go and have a look at that, if it's available, and certainly if it becomes available later on, I'll post that on the Facebook page.
Thanks. I'd add as well that I am interested. There's the presentation, which has got some video in it. I've also got a longer video and a report that's not quite suitable for the public domain, but I'm happy to share it with pretty much anyone. So you can find me on Facebook or something. Yeah,
and we'll share your contact details, at least the Facebook or website, in the podcast notes. So thanks very much. What's happening? What's next for you over the coming months and the next year?
Yeah, January, I've been spending the last couple of Januaries in Tasmania, madly running around pursuing cave exploration. I usually get a couple of sump dives in because they take a lot of effort. I think last year Sesame was a half-hour dive that took a week of my energy and a lot of other people's energy as well, who were amazing. Yeah, so COVID times, that's when I was released from lockdown. I just went to Tasmania and went nuts. And I'm going to do that again this January, even though haven't been in lockdown for a while. So, yeah, there's a new list of things to do. was talking about that 5 kilometre gap between the two major caves. I'm hoping to have a good definitive crack at that. There's one of the deep leads in Niggly Cave that's kind of just started. We've been looking at it for years. Last time it sort of looked like it was going to do something. There's a weird sump called the biohazard sump. It's pretty nasty, but it needs to be dived, I think. It's going to be a matter of 3 litre tanks and not much else.
Yeah, a bit of power snorkeling.
People might have heard about it. We did discover Australia's new deepest cave last January. We've been exploring it up until sort of July this year. That made the news cycles in various places.
I'm not sure it made it out of Australia, but anyhow, congratulations.
Oh, no. We got on CNN and in America and, the Daily Mail in the UK. And
the Kiwi thing shutting out Australia, you probably just beat us at cricket or something. And
yeah, you guys definitely beat us at caves. Our deepest cave's 400 metres. Yeah. Yours is 800 or 1,000. Yeah, and then the world's deepest is twice that again. We'll be going in through that new Delta variant entrance to push, and we'll camp underground, do a dive, some things.
Brilliant. Well, mate, I think we've covered some awesome ground. Again, I really appreciate you sharing on your presentations from Oztech. Again, if you get a chance and you'd like to go to a Southern Hemisphere and Australasian conference, I can highly recommend it from my own experience. It was brilliant to meet the speakers. We get a global collection there this year with Bill Stone, Michael Menduno, many others from overseas, from Europe and the States, other parts of the world, and of course, Australasian and New Zealand speakers as well. Just a brilliant event. The social side was also up to par as far as I was concerned. We had a great time after the event on each of the nights. So yeah, brilliant experience. Thoroughly recommended for the next one. So mate, again, great to meet you personally as well and spend a bit of time chatting, and thanks for sharing your stories with everyone. Again, brilliant.
Thanks, Steve. It's been great.
Thanks, mate. We'll catch you again soon.
Cheers, Steve.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was just stunning to hear how Stephen survived his near-death experience in the caves in Tasmania and how much he's learned about laryngospasm and how this potentially can affect us as divers. Thanks again to XDeep for their support. Thank you to the patrons of Speaking Sidemount for supporting the show. If you'd like to become a patron, go to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount, and there you'll find out all of the different levels. It can cost as little as a cup of coffee a month to help support this show, and it's sincerely appreciated. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.